The morning of my sister Chloe's wedding began not with the gentle rustle of silk or the joyous clinking of champagne flutes, but with the familiar, suffocating weight of my mother's voice slicing through the peace of my bridal suite. "It's just a matter of basic logistics, Maya," Beatrice said, her tone sharp as she smoothed down the front of her lavender mother of the bride gown. She didn't look at me. She was staring at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my living room, admiring how the sunlight caught her diamonds. "Chloe is the bride. She is entering a new phase of her life with Arthur. They need space to entertain, to build a network, to look like the couple they are meant to be. Your father and I have already discussed it. It's only right that you sign the deed over to them as a wedding gift." I sat perfectly still on my velvet chaise lounge, holding a cup of black coffee that had gone entirely cold. I looked past my mother, out at the breathtaking expanse of the Manhattan skyline stretching out beneath us. We were standing in my penthouse. It was a sprawling, three-story architectural masterpiece perched high above Central Park, featuring a private wraparound terrace, a glass-bottomed pool, and a view that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. It wasn't just a piece of real estate, it was the physical manifestation of my independence. And my parents wanted me to give it away like a piece of leftover wedding cake. "You're asking me to give my house to Chloe," I said, my voice dangerously flat, devoid of the emotion that was currently tearing a hole through my chest. "The house I bought. The house I paid for." "Oh, don't use that tone with me, Maya," Beatrice snapped, finally turning around to face me, her eyes narrowing into two icy slits. "You didn't buy it out of poverty. You used the money your grandmother gave you. It's family money, technically. And right now, the family needs that asset to go to the child who actually has a future that requires it. You're a single, 32-year-old woman who spends all her time managing tech investments. What do you need 3 bedrooms and a private elevator for? You're rattling around in here like a ghost." Before I could answer, the heavy double doors of the penthouse opened, and my father, Charles, walked in. He looked distinguished in his bespoke tuxedo, but his face carried that familiar expression of passive-aggressive authority he always used when he was about to demand something unreasonable. "Is it done, Beatrice?" Charles asked, glancing between us. He didn't look at me either. Instead, his eyes swept over the herringbone hardwood floors, the custom Italian marble fireplace, and the priceless modern art hanging on the walls. He nodded to himself, as if he were already mentally redecorating. "Maya is being difficult, as usual," Beatrice sighed, crossing her arms. "She's acting as if we're asking for her right arm, rather than a simple family transfer." "Maya," Charles said, his voice dropping into his deep, paternal lecture register. "Be reasonable. Arthur's family is old money. Very old money. They expect their son's new bride to bring something substantial to the table. Our family's hedge fund has had a volatile couple of quarters, which you would know if you ever bothered to look at the family ledger. We cannot afford to buy Chloe a property of this caliber right now. If Arthur's parents think we are struggling, it could ruin the merger of our interests. You have to do this for your sister. For the family name. And where am I supposed to live, father?" I asked, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "Am I supposed to pack up my things and move into a studio apartment in Queens so Chloe can play high society hostess in my living room?" "Don't be dramatic," Charles scoffed. "You can move into the corporate apartment on the Upper East Side. It's a perfectly fine 1-bedroom. More than enough space for a single woman. Besides, it's closer to your office. It's a win-win. A win-win. For them." For 32 years, this had been the dynamic of my life. Chloe was the golden child, the beautiful, compliant, delicate daughter who pursued ballet, married well, and smiled for the society pages. I was the eldest, the stubborn, unyielding daughter who preferred spreadsheets to cotillions, who refused to let my father manage my trust, and who had built my own venture capital firm without a single dime of my father's help. Because of that independence, I was treated like an outsider. An asset to be liquidated whenever Chloe needed a new shiny toy. "I am not giving Chloe my penthouse," I said, standing up. I set my cold coffee down on the marble table with a sharp clack. "The answer is no. I suggest you both leave and get ready for the ceremony. The cars will be here in an hour." Beatrice's face contorted into an ugly mask of rage. She took 2 steps toward me, her finger pointing directly at my face. "You selfish, ungrateful little girl. After everything we have given you. You gave me nothing." I fired back, the dam finally breaking. Grandmother Iris gave me the seed capital because she knew you and father would try to starve me out financially the moment I refused to marry the son of your business partner. This penthouse was bought with my own earnings from my first successful exit. My name is on the deed. It is my home, and I will see you both in hell before I sign it over to Chloe. Charles stepped between us, his face dark with a silent, menacing fury. We will discuss this later, Maya. At the reception, you will not ruin your sister's day with your jealousy. But mark my words, family loyalty is not optional. You will do what is expected of you, or there will be severe consequences. They turned and walked out, slamming the heavy oak doors behind them. I sank back onto the chaise lounge, my hands trembling. The silence of the empty penthouse pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, the old, familiar conditioning crept in, the guilt, the voice in the back of my mind telling me that maybe I was being selfish, that maybe a good daughter would just give up her happiness to keep the peace. Then, my phone buzzed on the table. It was a text message from a private number. The lion does not lose sleep over the opinions of the sheep, my darling. Put on your dress. I am arriving at the church now. Asterisk. I stared at the screen, and the trembling in my hands stopped. It was from Grandmother Iris. Iris Vance was the true matriarch of the family, though my parents routinely tried to forget it. She was 84 years old, possessed a mind as sharp as a diamond-tipped scalpel, and controlled the massive steel and shipping fortune that my grandfather had left entirely to her. My father, Charles, was her only son, but she had long since realized he lacked the brilliance and grit required to run the empire. She had kept him on a strict corporate allowance, a fact that drove my father absolutely mad with resentment. Iris had been watching my parents' manipulative antics for decades. And if she was sending me messages like this, it meant she already knew what they were up to. I stood up, walked into my walk-in closet, and looked at the dress I had chosen for the wedding. It wasn't the pastel, muted bridesmaid dress my mother had tried to force me into. Since I wasn't part of the official bridal party, a punishment from Chloe because I refused to pay for her $150,000 bachelorette party in Saint-Tropez, I was just a regular guest. I had chosen a structured, floor-length gown of midnight blue silk. It was elegant, commanding, and looked exactly like armor. The St. Regis Church was a spectacle of absolute opulence. White orchids draped from every marble pillar, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and burning beeswax. The pews were packed with the elite of New York high society, politicians, CEOs, old money heirs, and fashion icons. I arrived just before the doors closed, slipping into a pew near the back. I watched as Chloe floated down the aisle in a custom Vera Wang gown that cost more than a luxury vehicle. She looked beautiful, a perfect porcelain doll, smiling radiantly at Arthur, who stood at the altar looking handsome, wealthy, and entirely vacuous. Throughout the ceremony, I could feel my mother's eyes darting back toward me from the front row. Every glance she threw my way was laced with venom. My father sat stiffly beside her, his shoulders tense. They weren't thinking about the holy matrimony of their youngest daughter, they were thinking about the 3-story piece of real estate they were determined to steal from their oldest. When the ceremony concluded and the guests began to file out toward the waiting fleet of black limousines, I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. I turned around to see a tall, impeccably dressed man in his late 40s with a leather briefcase tucked under his arm. It was Arthur Pendleton, Grandmother Iris's personal, high-powered corporate attorney. He rarely appeared in public unless massive amounts of money were about to change hands. "Miss Vance," Arthur said with a polite bow of his head. "Your grandmother requests your presence in her limousine. She has designated a specific seat for you." "Thank you, Arthur," I said, a small spark of hope igniting in my chest. "Lead the way." We bypassed the main crowd and walked toward a vintage, pristine black Rolls-Royce parked at the curb, flanked by 2 private security guards. The door was opened for me, and I slid into the plush leather interior. Sitting in the back seat, wrapped in a magnificent silver sable coat despite the mild weather, was Grandmother Iris. Her silver hair was styled perfectly, her signature emerald rings catching the light, and her eyes, the same dark, piercing eyes I had inherited, were bright with anticipation. "Look at you," Iris murmured, reaching out to touch my cheek with a gloved hand. "You look like a woman who is ready to fight a war." "Good, because your parents have officially lost their minds. They came to my penthouse this morning, I said, leaning back against the seat as the Rolls-Royce pulled smoothly into traffic. They demanded I sign the deed over to Chloe as a wedding gift. Father threatened me with severe consequences if I refuse. Iris let out a soft, dark chuckle that sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. Charles always did have a grand imagination and a pitiful lack of leverage. He thinks because he is the man of the family, he controls the board. He forgets who built the board. What are you going to do, Grandma? I asked. Iris leaned forward, her expression turning incredibly cold, the kind of look that had made hardened corporate raiders weep in boardrooms 40 years ago. Your father has been mismanaging the family hedge fund for 5 years, Maya. He thinks I don't notice. He has been taking short-term loans against family assets to maintain his lifestyle and to fund Chloe's absurd extravagances. This wedding alone cost nearly $500,000, and do you know whose money paid for it? Yours. No, Iris said, a dangerous smile spreading across her lips. He tried to draw from my accounts, but I blocked him months ago. He took out a bridge loan using his own shares in the Vance Holding Company as collateral. He is completely leveraged to the hilt. He desperately needs your penthouse because Arthur's father, Julian Vance, who is a snake of the highest order, discovered Charles's debts. Julian told Charles that unless Chloe brings a premier Manhattan property into the marriage free and clear, he will call off the business merger that is supposed to save your father's fund. The pieces of the puzzle instantly fell into place. The desperation, the tears from my mother weeks ago, the aggressive demands this morning, it wasn't just about Chloe having a nice place to live. It was a desperate, panicked attempt by my parents to save themselves from financial ruin by sacrificing me. They were going to throw me to the wolves to save their own skins, I whispered, a cold anger settling into my bones. They were, Iris agreed, tapping her cane on the floor of the car. But they forgot one very important detail. I own the wolves. Arthur, she said, looking at the attorney sitting in the front seat. Are the documents finalized? Yes, Madam Vance, Arthur replied without turning around. The execution orders have been signed, notarized, and filed electronically. They will take effect precisely at 9 p.m. tonight, right during the main toasts at the reception. Iris looked back at me, her eyes gleaming with absolute malice toward the people who had dared to hurt her favorite granddaughter. Tonight, Maya, we are going to attend a wedding. And then, we are going to watch an empire fall. The reception was held at the Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom. It was a masterclass in high society vanity. Thousands of white roses hung from the ceilings, crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the diamonds of 500 guests, and a 20-piece orchestra played a soft, waltzing melody. My parents were in their absolute element. I watched from afar as Beatrice flitted from table to table, holding a glass of champagne, loudly telling anyone who would listen about Chloe's new life, Arthur's family lineage, and the magnificent family estate that would soon be the couple's primary residence. She was already talking about my penthouse as if it were Chloe's. Oh, yes, I heard Beatrice laugh loudly to a group of wealthy socialites near the caviar bar. The views are simply unparalleled. We felt it was the perfect token of our affection for the young couple. A family tradition, really. I stood near a marble pillar, sipping a glass of real champagne, watching the display with a sense of detached amusement. They had no idea. At around 8:30 p.m., dinner was served. I was seated at table 12, a deliberate snub by my mother, placed far to the back near the kitchen doors, while the rest of the immediate family sat at the grand royal table at the front of the room. Grandmother Iris, however, had refused her seat at the head table. She had demanded a separate, smaller table right in the center of the room, positioning herself like a monarch watching her court. As the clock ticked closer to 9 p.m., my father walked up to the microphone on the elevated stage. The orchestra faded out, and the room grew quiet. Guests clinked their glasses, turning their attention to the front of the room where Chloe and Arthur sat, beaming like a king and queen. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, and family, Charles began, his voice booming through the high-end sound system. He looked confident, powerful, the epitome of successful old money. Today is the happiest day of my life. To see my beautiful daughter Chloe marry a man of such stellar character as Arthur is everything a father could hope for. Applause rippled through the room. Charles smiled, basking in the adulation. As many of you know, Charles continued, his eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto me at table 12, his gaze turning hard and triumphant. In our circle, a marriage is not just the union of two hearts, but the strengthening of a legacy. And to ensure that my daughter and her new husband begin their journey with the absolute best our family has to offer, I am proud to announce a very special wedding gift. My mother, Beatrice, leaned forward at her table, a smug, vicious smirk plastered across her face. She looked at me and mouthed the words, "You lose." Tonight, Charles declared, raising his glass high. We are officially transferring the deed of the Vance Penthouse on Central Park West to Chloe and Arthur. A sanctuary of luxury for their new life together. The room erupted into gasps and loud applause. People turned to look at Chloe, who gasped delicately and covered her mouth with her manicured hands, pretending to be surprised by the gift she had been demanding for 3 weeks. Julian Vance, Arthur's wealthy father, gave Charles a slow, approving nod from his seat. The merger was safe. Charles had delivered the prize. But I didn't move. I didn't look angry. I simply looked down at my watch. 8:59 p.m. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom opened. 2 men in dark suits entered, walking with purpose down the center aisle toward the main stage. They weren't hotel staff. They carried folders bearing the official seal of the New York State Banking Disciplinary Committee and the Supreme Court of New York. The applause died down to a confused murmur as the men walked straight past the guests and stepped onto the stage, interrupting my father. "What is the meaning of this?" Charles hissed, dropping the microphone slightly, though his voice still carried through the speakers. "This is a private event. Security, remove these men." The lead man, an older gentleman with an expressionless face, pulled a document from his folder and handed it to Charles. "Charles Vance, I am Agent Miller from the State Financial Regulatory Authority. We are serving you with an emergency asset freeze and a corporate receivership order. As of 5 minutes ago, Vance Financial and all associated personal accounts have been locked due to suspected fraudulent conversion and loan default." A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed through the 500 guests in the grand ballroom. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to crush the room. "What?" Charles's voice cracked, the microphone amplifying his sudden, raw panic. "That's impossible. There's been a mistake. My fund is perfectly solvent." It was solvent. A loud, clear, aristocratic voice rang out from the center of the room. Everyone turned. Grandmother Iris stood up from her chair, leaning lightly on her silver-headed cane. She didn't look like an old woman at a wedding, she looked like an executioner. Arthur Pendleton, her attorney, stood beside her, holding his leather briefcase. He stepped forward and opened a tablet, tapping the screen once to cast an image onto the massive projector screens that had been set up to show childhood photos of Chloe and Arthur. Instead of photos, the giant screens suddenly displayed a series of corporate legal documents, financial ledgers, and a massive red stamp that read, "Foreclosure and Termination." "Mother," Charles stammered, his face turning a horrific, ghostly shade of white as he stared at the screens. What are you doing?" "I am correcting a mistake I made 30 years ago when I allowed you to use my husband's name," Iris said, her voice clear, carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom. She didn't need a microphone. Her authority was absolute. "For 5 years, Charles, you have stolen from the family trust to fund your delusions of grandeur," Iris stated coldly, her eyes scanning the room, exposing my parents' shame to the very high society peers they had spent their lives trying to impress. "You took out a bridge loan to pay for this absurdly vulgar wedding, using your shares in the Vance Holding Company as collateral. You assumed I wouldn't find out. You assumed that if you forced my granddaughter Maya to give up her penthouse, you could use her asset to satisfy Julian Vance's demands and hide your bankruptcy." Beatrice stood up from her chair, her face twisted in horror, her diamonds shaking as she trembled. "Iris, stop this. This is a wedding. Think of the scandal. The scandal began when you raised a thief and a parasite, Beatrice," Iris snapped, her voice like a whip. At 9 p.m. tonight, the note on Charles's bridge loan became due. The lender of that loan was a private equity firm called Nova Capital. What you did not know, Charles, is that Nova Capital is a wholly owned subsidiary of my estate. Charles collapsed slightly against the podium, his hand gripping the wood to keep from falling over. You bow.